While returning to the village, the hunters caught sight of a polar bear on a tiny island in the sea ice. Kulout fired and slightly wounded the bear in the rump. He ran into the water and turned to regard his tormentors. Polar bears have absolutely nothing to fear in their environment except humans. It's likely that in the vastness of their Arctic world, most of them go through their lives without ever seeing a human. This is at least true of the lucky ones. As he looks at us, he seemed to be more puzzled than injured. The hunters threw pieces of snow at him to get him to move out of the water. The photographer foolishly moved in too close, and the bear reared up out of the water and charged. Kulout kneeled and fired, and remarkably downed the bear on the very spot where seconds before the camera had been. The shot had been placed exactly right, or one bullet would not have stopped him. This undoubtedly saved the photographer's life. It's not pleasant to watch a beautiful animal die, but the hunters needed the meat and the skin, and they were happy about the kill. Kulout cautiously moves closer to ascertain that the bear, in fact, is dead. They sometimes have one more swipe of their massive paws just before they die. The bear had fallen into a shallow crevasse in the ice, and the men had a real struggle to get him out onto the flat ice so they could begin to cut the carcass into sizes that would fit into the boat. He was a medium-sized male in prime condition. At first, skinning him and cutting him up was a problem because, in their haste to pursue the bear, the men had left their working knives in the boat about a quarter-mile away in the ice. However, the process began with pocket knives, while someone went back to the boat for proper cutting tools. Moving such a large carcass was no easy matter. The hunters were happy to have some real mammal fat instead of the sea mammal blubber for a change, and this was a fat bear. It was a fine, large pelt in top condition. It would eventually be used on a sleeping platform in an igloo, but for now it served as a kind of sled to transport the meat back to the boat. In butchering the bear, the hunters were careful to throw the liver into the sea. Eating the liver of a polar bear can cause severe A hypervitaminosis, and neither dogs nor people will eat it. On the way home, the hunters not only added a polar bear to the boatload of walrus meat, but also a white whale, or beluga. The vessel was down to the water nearly to the gunwales. Women, children, and old men came down to the boat to admire and comment on the bounty of the hunt and to ask for details of the hunt itself. In the hunters' absence, by the way, the huge, voracious Arctic mosquitoes had arrived and also came to greet the men. The meat had to be offloaded from the boat and dragged up on the beach so that the women could begin to process it. This involved separating some of the blubber from the meat and skin so that it could be used as fuel. Smaller bundles of meat are also put together for sharing among the families. This is all done according to well-known and traditional protocol. The white whale carcass comes ashore, as well as a very slippery slab of the animal's highly prized skin, prized not as hide, but as food. The women carefully open the walrus stomachs to remove the delicious bits of mussels and clam meat and some of the bottom vegetation which the walruses also feed on. It's about the only source of green food available to the people. Kulout takes some of the meat to the tent of his mother, who's a deaf mute. She sits amid an odd mixture of tradition and change, including an alarm clock. People gather at the shore to feast on the pure white whale skin and its pink blubber, and the men continue their stories about the hunt. The people have been fed, and meat is put into some of their tents, but the dogs need to have their share as well. They're absolutely essential to the traditional Iglulingmiut way of life, and these people take very good care of them. Some of the meat is dragged to an open spot away from the tents and cut up while the dogs wait for the signal. When the signal comes, they rush in from all sides, and the contest begins. In the summer, The dogs are only fed about once every 3 days because they're not working. They're very hungry and sometimes get into fights to get their share, and hopefully somebody else's share as well. Puppies need to get discreetly out of the way. Their owners may separately feed them later. A tug-of-war breaks out among several dogs, each of which wants the whole piece. Finally, when every scrap and crumb of meat is gone, the fighting is over, and the dogs return slowly and peacefully to their cool and comfortable places of summer rest. Well, the people have eaten, and the dogs have been fed, and there's still plenty of meat left over. It's going to be needed later in the year, when there may be long periods of little hunting because the weather and the winter has closed in. The meat is stored in shallow pits dug in the tundra gravel down to the permafrost, which is the permanently frozen soil just under the surface. The meat bundles, put together out on the ice pans during the hunt, are carefully placed in the pit, leaving air spaces around them. The gravel is shoveled back over the meat, and by the time the people leave the walrus camp and go back to the main village at Iglulingmiut, the overlying gravel is likely to be frozen hard enough so that wolves and bears and wolverines can't dig it up. Periodically, as needed during the winter, men will come back to these caches and chop out the frozen meat. It will then be taken back to their village and thawed and fed to both people and dogs. Each mound of gravel is satisfying and comforting insurance for the people for another winter to come. To facilitate the archaeological work to be done at Iglulingmiut, a work tent and a small sleeping tent were set up about a quarter-mile inland from Iglulingmiut village when the spring melt permitted. The culture of the prehistoric people who lived here just prior to the Iglulingmiut is called Thule. They were preceded some thousands of years earlier by another people whose distinctive culture is called Dorset. We were looking for pure Dorset sites, and we found them on Iglulingmiut Island. The project fascinated Father Guy Marie Rousselier of the Oblate Mission at Iglulingmiut, and he volunteered to assist with the excavations. Jorgen Meldgaard, an experienced Arctic archaeologist from the Danish National Museum, represented that institution's interests in the expedition. No Dorset skeletal material had yet been found at such sites. This mandible, or lower jaw, was found here in a Dorset burial. While excavating Dorset sites, the men also investigated some adjacent Thule sites, such as this one being opened by Richard Emerick of the University Museum in Philadelphia. When excavating the middens, or garbage heaps, near the Thule house, Emerick found large quantities of walrus bones from prehistoric hunts. Using long bones and a few lower jaw bones, he fashioned an anniversary greeting to his wife. It was their first anniversary. One of the earliest Dorset burials was found at nearly 50 meters elevation on the island. In the Arctic, with its permafrost, interment is not possible, so sepulchres of stone are built around the body. Meldgaard discovers an early Dorset grave and, typically, an immediately adjacent grave goods chamber. In these chambers were placed the tools and trophies and ornaments and weapons and other personal belongings, possibly for the deceased's use in an afterlife. On the warmest day of that summer in Iglulingmiut, when the temperature almost reached 70 degrees, excavations continued at a Dorset house site. Carefully digging and finding hundreds of small pieces of material information is what makes it possible for archaeologists to discover and describe and eventually understand a prehistoric way of life.